I hope you've enjoyed the earlier sessions of the day, and welcome to our final discussion of day one of Ignites. I'm Plum Lomax, and I lead our impact investing work here at MPC, as well as working with philanthropy clients. And I'm really delighted to introduce you to Danielle Walker Palmour, one of the leaders within the foundation sector to have embraced impact investing, and I think we'll all have so much to learn from her experience. Just before we start, a few kind of guidelines. Do ask questions throughout using the either the Q&A function or the chat function, and I'll come back to a selection of them at the end. Do also feel free to sort of post general comments and thoughts and reactions as we go. We are being recorded and there are journalists present, just to inform you. And if I do happen to drop off, my colleague Peter is going to take over as in this. Hopefully that won't happen. Before we start, I just wanted to set the scene really about sort of UK foundations and responsible or impact investment. There is really enormous change going on within the impact investment field across kind of all areas, across all asset owners, whether that's pension funds, high net worth individuals, and of course foundations. And there's no doubt that COVID is accelerating this change as people, I think, are rethinking various aspects of their lives, really including where and how their money is invested. But it's still only a minority of foundations like Friends Provident who have really kind of put this into action. There was the Foundation Giving Trends 2019 report showed that the top 300 foundations in the UK have almost 70 billion of assets between them, and yet only 34 of those 300 have identified social investment in their accounts, and that's only accounting for 0.2% of their assets. It's growing. That was a growth of 24% from the previous year. That definition is clearly social investment, the impact first side of things, where positive social outcomes are prioritised over financial returns, and it doesn't include the amount of assets being invested responsibly or sustainably, where the data does look more positive. There was a report last week from Cazenove Capital on intentional investing. And that showed, this was a survey of charity investors, about 300 charity investors, so not just foundations. And it showed that 77% of these respondents have now decided to adopt a policy to link their mission to investments, compared to 59% in 2015 and only 23% in 2010. So, we've come a long way in a decade, and there is significant growth, but there's lots more to be done. And Danielle hopefully can give us some pointers as to how to get going on investing your assets responsibly and in line with your mission. Just a quick intro to Danielle. She was the founding director of Friends Provident Foundation. The foundation is an independent charity endowed by Friends Provident PLC after its demutualisation. Under her leadership, the foundation has an international reputation for innovative funding and investment practice, and is at the forefront of rethinking the role of philanthropic resources in the UK. And the mission of the foundation is to create a fair and sustainable economy, and we'll hear a bit more about that in a minute. Danielle's occupied senior policy and research roles throughout the non-governmental sector, such as with Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the Commission for Racial Equality, and the Law Society of England and Wales. She served in an advisory role as a member of the Treasury's Financial Inclusion Task Force, the Civil Society Advisory Body of the Cabinet Office, and the Financial Services Authority Financial Capability Steering Group. She's also a board member of the National Lottery Community Fund, a trustee of Britain Yearly Meeting Quakers, and has advisory roles related to the University of York. She also, some of you may have seen that she chaired the ACF, the Association of Charitable Foundations, International Intentional Investment Working Group that fed into their Stronger Foundations report. We're going to link to these reports in the chat, and also guest edited the September issue of Alliance magazine on this very issue that we're going to discuss today. And just before we start, it would be great we're going to run a quick poll from you. Great to gather a bit of information about who's in the audience, aware I've already kind of mentioned quite a few terms that might not be familiar to all of you. It's one of the downsides of working in this particular space, all the jargon. So do answer the poll that should be coming up in the chat function any minute. And then we'll respond to that in a minute. So Danielle, just to get started, for those in the audience that are not familiar with your foundation, can you briefly kind of expand a little bit on your mission to create a fair economy and a better world, and really how you are using your endowment as a tool for change to meet that mission?
Thanks, Plum. I suppose it all started in 2004 when the foundation was endowed by Friends Provident. And we were really interested, trustees at that time particularly were interested in how financial systems, which is, reflecting where the foundation came from, could serve society better. How could financial systems as a kind of engine for good, for capital distribution, how could it serve society better? And that was from 2004. I think after 2008, trustees and the financial crash, there was a kind of rethink. I think everyone did a bit of a rethink. But I suppose one of the things that trustees at the time were clear about was that perhaps the financial system was not this sort of benign at best and neutral at worst kind of machine that we needed to hook people up to. Perhaps it wasn't actually fit for purpose. And we kind of expanded our interest into looking at how the economy as a whole might serve society better. And the analysis underpinning that is that currently the economy produces lots of things which society needs and relies on, like jobs, wealth, goods and services, ways of exchanging monetary and other kinds of value. But it also produces a lot of things that we as philanthropists and the state spend a lot of our time, money and energy trying to kind of sort out. Things like incredible inequality and growing inequality, environmental degradation, and the economy isn't that great as a tool for valuing current needs in relation to future needs. So that kind of balance, it's kind of myopic in that we tend to privilege what we need now, as opposed to what we might need in the future in terms of resources. So given these flaws, the question became, how could the economy be redesigned and rethought so that it doesn't produce these negative outcomes? And I suppose one of the things that came through that as a foundation was the recognition that we were in the economy. We have most of our assets deeply embedded in the system we were trying to change. And, if you're sitting on not a lot of money in foundation terms, but, 30 million pounds, which is embedded in a system that you're trying to change, you start thinking, well, what can that 30 million pounds do to take forward our mission? And that's really the beginning of our interest. And we really did try to work out how we could use those assets to be a spark for changing the system we were embedded in.
And kind of what did it practically involve to really get to where you are today in this very integrated approach?
In terms of integration, essentially we sort of took the view we needed to throw everything we had at it. We usually philanthropists talk about using their staff and their trustees and their networks and their convening power and their grants in pursuit of mission, which is all what we need to do. Absolutely vital we do these things. But I suppose we were thinking we've also got 30 million pounds that is, to be honest, was invested in such a way that it was doing no harm. So it was ethically invested, but it was very much do no harm. We weren't entirely sure it was doing any good. So I think we thought we needed to kind of really get to grips with it. And in terms of integration, I really think it was because we are so small. The same people who think about the grants were also thinking about the investments. They weren't different people, they were the same people in terms of staff and trustees. And secondly, we really did need to maximize our assets to with a huge mission like that, it's impossible not to think, well, you know, we need to kind of have more than like 1.5 million or 2 million pounds to throw at this problem. So we were very much, you know, using all of it. So using all the things we usually use as philanthropists, plus our other assets. And also, I think we also were aware of our time as an asset, because we didn't have that much of that either. And in terms of the urgency of some of the issues like environmental degradation and climate change, we really needed to get our skates on. So we did notice that, in fact, we were spending about 90% of our time on about 10% of our assets, because we were spending a lot of time on grants and a lot of time on impact investment, but not that much on the 30 million. So we thought we needed to rejig that quite a bit.
And can you just kind of, I guess, explain or describe to people in the audience around the range of the assets that you use, you know, including your time, but particularly the sort of range of the investments that you have, both in mainstream markets, but also in the more sort of impact first type of investments, just to give a flavour, I guess, of what you've got.
Well, we were a relatively early adopter on the impact first financial on social investments or mission investing. So it was quite a long time ago now, I think it's something like 12 years. We started very tentatively trying to find social investments which were in line with our kind of previous function, which is very financial services and financial inclusion focused. So we invested in things like Charity Bank, and we invested in Eastlink's Moneyline, which was providing affordable credit to low-income people. And so we really sort of, I think in impact investing, and we've continued this, and we've kind of moved it into new areas like community energy and community renewables. But starting from what you know from grants, so we understood about affordable credit. We understood about the importance of financial services that are accessible and affordable to people. So we kind of built our social investments from our knowledge of our impact investment from our knowledge of grants. So that was really kind of the direction of travel for us. Our mainstream investment portfolio is invested in just a standard, it's a deep green ESG fund. And it's a sort of fund that came very much from our heritage as Friends Provident. So Friends Provident was one of the first developers of ESG funds in the UK. And our connection very much came from that. We are expanding that now, and I don't know if we'll come on to it, but we actually looked for a new asset owner to bring our investments a little bit more in line with the objectives of our impact investment objectives, and we're entering into a new arrangement with Cazenove that's seeding a new fund, which is much more impact directed.
Great. Well, we might come back to that in a bit more detail. But you know, you talked about one of the assets being your time, and I know that you take quite an unusual role, I guess, as a foundation of being a very sort of active shareholder as well. And it would be, you know, we know that you had created a specific role back in 2016 for an investment engagement manager. Could you kind of, I guess, describe some of the thinking that went behind creating that role, but also some of the types of engagement that have taken place as a result of that, with that kind of activism in mind?
Yes, it was a really an interesting process, and it was really about maximising our input and what we could do. It was about time. It was recognising that we were spending a lot of governance time and a lot of staff time on the grants, and we had almost no resource in terms of staffing, particularly, though we did have some expert trustees, so that wasn't so much of an issue. But we didn't have an investment committee. We had a general committee. So we created an investment committee to focus governance time on investments. And then we also created a role, which was very much about helping us to think in a much more structured way about the function of our investments. And it was really about knowing, building our knowledge base. We had no idea. We were invested in an ESG fund. We didn't actually know what we held. We didn't really know. I mean, many foundations, if you say, what are your top 10 holdings? They can't tell you. Mind you, don't ask me, because I don't know off the top of my head. But I can find out very quickly, because we have a member of staff whose job it is to think about that. So knowing our holdings and talking to our asset managers about that. Engaging with our asset managers, we actually have time and energy to talk to them more than, a couple of times a year. We'd call them up and say, what's happening with this? Or I see we're holding this. How long are we holding something we're not expecting to be holding that perhaps isn't within our investment mandate? And we have, a good discussion about that. We also have done quite a lot of thinking about what issues that we, as in terms of who we are and what we know, we can make an impact on. Very similar to the kinds of conversations you have about grants, how you choose a grants program. We have the same sort of conversations about our investments, and our investment engagement manager really helps us do that. And also gives us some capacity to do collaborations and engage with other funders and investors. And we're involved in a range of different collaborations in Europe, a network called Shareholders for Change. And also in the UK, there is actually quite a lot of really good networks, particularly the Charities Responsible Investment Network. And we have capacity to engage in those. The other thing we do, which is quite unusual, is that, yes, we are an ESG investor, but we also do have change objectives. And occasionally, corporates are the people who need to change. So we have a capacity to buy shares in organizations and companies we would not normally hold in order to engage with them, to go along to their AGM, to ask questions, and to put pressure on them to bring about the kinds of changes we're hoping to see. So, I mean, if you're concerned about gender equality or diversity on boards, that's something you can buy shares in a company that you want to engage with on that. And ask those questions and start putting those, because shareholders can engage. And so we have actually been able to do that. But on the impact investment side, it also gives us, capacity to do horizon scannings and to engage with the various structures, which enable us to find new investments which are in line with our mission, which is absolutely vital.
Thank you. Do you think that is a trend that other foundations are going to be more involved in terms of that sort of active shareholder role?
I hope so. I mean, at least one other foundation now has, my colleague's name is Colin. We say someone else has got a Colin. So he's a popular guy, being cloned, which is great. And at least one other foundation, they're a lot bigger, and they are really active now. And that's Len Kelly Chase Foundation. Mm-hmm. And they have a Colin whose name is Dominic. And we really hope that this idea of giving yourself the capacity, in a similar way to as foundations did around impact investing, creating a team or at least a member of staff whose job it is to think about this all the time, as opposed to it being off the side of the desk of the finance director. It seems like a really important function. It feels right. But I have to say, foundations in the UK are quite bad at spending money on themselves. They very, very often want to just get the money out the door without thinking, well, actually, how can we maximize our impact? So I think there's a cultural issue there.
Yeah. And tell me about some of the sort of challenges that you faced along the way. And I guess, in terms of actually kind of shifting the assets into this way of investing.
Yes, I mean, the challenges in shifting the assets, I think it is really, it's a technical topic, as you mentioned when you were doing your introduction. So, getting us all at a reasonable level of understanding and knowledge is a challenge. But I suppose one of the things we've learned is asking the stupid question is incredibly important. It's amazing how asking the very simplest question, trustees do it, staff do it, just asking your asset managers, but why are we investing expecting 10% growth in this particular investment? That just seems outsized and actually not sustainable. And it opens up a whole range of different conversations, which actually you may have a view on. Though, you might get a technical load of jargon coming back, which is what you're terrified. It's a bit like asking a question in French and you're thinking, oh no, well, I understand the answer. But sometimes you actually do, and you actually understand it better than the person who's articulating it. So I think we've learned to ask the stupid question, and that is a barrier to getting past internally. I think also the thing for us, and I think this is true for many people who do social and impact investing in addition to their endowment, is actually, if you start doing what we do, which is actually thinking about your impact. I mean, we thought ourselves as not a grant maker. We don't call ourselves a grant maker anymore. And this feels like a really important sort of cognitive shift, which means that we're thinking about ourselves in terms of all of our assets, meaning we call ourselves a capitalized charity, and our impact is to be assessed across all of our assets, so all of our capital. So what our mainstream investment are doing is as important as what our impact or social investments are doing, which is as important as our grants. And so actually getting those impact measures in place is actually quite tricky, and making them make sense to each other and ourselves. So creating our narrative has been a challenge, but I think that cognitive shift to think, well, actually what all of this is doing has got to be supportive mission, and we can't just decide, oh, this nice cozy bit is the bit we're going to call ourselves grant maker, even though most of our assets are actually sitting in the stock market. So we are very much that cognitive shift is quite a challenge, but I think it's an important one for people to get through.
That's interesting that you've actually kind of changed the whole lens through the way you describe yourselves, and that was an important part of the movement. I guess, in the context of trying to build back better post the pandemic and the deep inequalities that COVID's uncovered, I think many foundations are keen to bring about economic change and more justice. But there is this underlying tension between the system that they're trying to change and, I guess, the resumption of financial health for the sake of their endowment or their grant making. How do you see that tension being resolved?
No, to be honest, I think it is so difficult. I do think it's hard, which is actually why why it's not happening so as quickly as one would hope. It's difficult, but I do feel one of the things we have certainly understood from the approach of using mission investing and using our mainstream endowment is that we really understand the investment process and how capital does move within the economy. And understanding that means that you can actually be more nuanced in terms of your approach to things. We understand the nature of returns. So we understand, one of the things we've certainly understood is as we are deeply invested in the economy. We are also deeply invested in a return to what might be called the status quo. As foundations, the return to the same returns we had before, which might or might not, in our case it isn't, but it could be based on fossil fuels, it's based on consumption of, overconsumption potentially, it's based on moving around the planet in a way that may or may not be sustainable. And I think the dip in returns that happened in March, April, kind of brought us all up short to realize how invested we were in the way things were going that we actually knew was not sustainable or good. And I think we just realized that quite a lot. And I think that's an important thing. I think for us, we feel like we've got skin in the game, and it also gives us, we're both open to the anxiety that people feel about the nature of the economy and it, potentially going down the pan, because our organizational health to some degree rests on investment. So we understand the anxiety, but we also can see we're open to the opportunities that actually realigning our portfolio even more with sustainable activity, so investing more in sustainable energy, and changing our way of thinking about things, and having much more sustainable consumption as part of our portfolio. Those are the kinds of things where really it's very clear we need to move in the direction of. And I think when you are thinking in this way, it does make the investment process and hopefully our long-term financial health a much more straightforward or clear path. I think if we were invested in fossil fuels, we would just want return to fossil fuel returns, and that wouldn't be the direction of travel.
Yeah, interesting. We're getting a few questions coming in, which I'll come back to in a minute. But there was a question actually earlier on Twitter this morning from Dr. Carla Barrett, that I think is quite relevant here around, what kind of size of foundations can kind of adopt this the same approach, and what are the first steps that you'd kind of suggest towards investing for impact?
Oh, that's a great question. It's quite a tricky one. I mean, as I said before, I think actually being small means that you are naturally, thinking, oh gosh, you have a big mission, you have a small amount of money, you're constantly thinking, how can we make this go further? So I think that's a great place to start. And I think the second part, which is helpful, is that we, as a foundation, we're the same people thinking about everything. And I think that does help. I think it is really just really being clear in some ways, and it goes what your mission is. So this is a very much a theme of the Intentional Investment Working Group and the ACF Strong Pillars for a Stronger Foundation, is that, being really clear, going back to your mission, think, what are we here to do? What is it, our particular gifts? If you think of it that way, what can we do? What is the things? What are the things we can do? And building from there. So thinking about if it is about gender equality or race equality, thinking the degree to which, how is this reflected in all the ways our money is working? So we thought about it really like, okay, how does our concern with, essentially the economy delivering very poor outcomes for large numbers, for communities that have been stuck in poverty for a very long time, how can we reflect this in our grant making and the practical projects we're doing, but also how can we reflect it in the mission investing that we're doing? So we looked, for, it didn't escape our notice that, community energy tends to be and renewables tend to be, they tend to be quite often in the Southwest, and they sometimes are actually in relatively affluent places. And we thought, well, how can we, work towards supporting the development of renewables and addressing fuel poverty in areas that are urban and that are perhaps traditionally not included in renewable energy projects? And so we actually worked with Repowering London, which is doing quite a lot of work on that, which is really exciting in Hackney and in London and in Brixton, and putting solar panels on tower blocks and addressing fuel poverty in London. So thought about it in terms of our mission investing. Then we also thought, well, how does it play through to our mainstream investments? And looking at in detail at what energy companies we held, what were their practices in terms of thinking about transitioning to renewable fuels. And we've actually engaged actively with SSE, and we actually bought shares in SSE because we didn't hold it. And they have actually, we've worked with them to develop a just transition plan, which is actually about their transition, which is balancing the needs of communities as well as the fossil fuels. And so it's really just like trying to start from what you know, and then just follow the money, follow it through in terms of, the way your money is working.
And I guess sort of related to that, there's been a question from the audience around hearing your views on why so many foundations are really behind on this journey.
Yeah, I suppose one of the things I've learned from the ACF process of working with a number, 12 foundations who are, I mean, I must admit, we were probably a minority, fascinated by investments and the possibilities of it. But I found there's actually so much going on. One thing I'd say, and it goes back to my point I made before, foundations aren't brilliant at talking about themselves in a kind of, hey, look, this is what we're doing. They tend to talk about the grantees very happily, but they tend not to talk about so much of we're doing this or we're thinking this. And I think there's actually quite a lot going on, but perhaps it's just, not really as well publicized as other sectors might do, because in some ways we're a bit weird because we don't have donors. We don't have government funders that we need to please. Essentially, if we don't break the law, we're kind of can just get on with it. And I think foundations tend to do that. So I think we're a bit behind on the comms, but I do think there's a lot going on. But I think it is this rethinking yourself as a different kind of entity. If you think you're a grant maker, that's what you're concentrating your energy on. But I think it's rethinking yourself as something else.
Yeah, I think that's a really clear message that's come out of today. So just, you may not have seen the poll results that have been coming through in terms of the audience. So it seems as if around 2/3 of the audience, 66%, are involved in some way. It's kind of split equally between those that are foundations, charities and advisors on this. And 34% that aren't. So hopefully we'll be shifting some of that 34% as we move. So thank you everyone for responding to that poll. Some questions coming through in terms of measurement, always music to our ears at NPC. One of them is from Sally Ann Greenfield, in terms of what do you measure your investment returns on other than the financial gain on assets?
Well, we do ask them about their engagement. So I can send you some materials from my colleague, but we actually do ask, how, because our asset managers are quite often engaging with companies on a variety of topics and issues. So that could be remuneration, it could be gender equality, it could be, fossil fuels, could be a variety of things. But quite often they do a lot of engagement, which means they talk to companies and they express concern about their working practices in terms of how they treat their workers, conditions, etc., etc. But they don't necessarily tell us how effective it is. And so we're actually really interested, and we push them quite hard to tell us, how effective was your engagement? How did you vote? And in terms of going to the AGM, did you support management, or did you withhold your support from management? So we looked at voting, we looked at what they're engaging on and the effectiveness of it. We looked at the alignment of their practices with SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, and we started contextualizing those financial returns, and to be thinking, well, actually, your money's doing a lot of things other than multiplying itself out there. And we wanted to make sure those things it was doing was actually, adding to our mission, or if it isn't, asking why. As I say, asking a stupid question is sometimes incredibly powerful.
Yeah. Just kind of looking at the US today and going back to your the Alliance magazine article in September around the Hewlett Foundation. It's interesting that they've taken really quite a strong stance in opposition to your own, and Larry Kramer's been quite vocal around the sort of condemning demands for foundations to divest from fossil fuels and sort of rejecting impact investing in preference for generating the best returns with their assets and then using grants to fight particular causes. That's really kind of often in direct opposition to what they're trying to do. So I'd be really interested to hear your view on their approach. I think you spoke to him recently on this openly for Alliance, and others that share that kind of view.
I have to say one thing. I came into the Hewlett discussion. I have great respect for Larry. He's a really super clever man, and also I really like the fact they're quite combative, which in our sector we're all kind of quite collegiate. We all say, "Oh, that's a very good point." But it's very nice someone saying, I think that's a load of rubbish or whatever. That's always quite, engaging on some level. I don't know why I think that, but I did. But I did actually come away with a view that, though we certainly, and I certainly, I suppose personally, it wouldn't subscribe to the conclusions they've drawn and how they go about it. I absolutely, first of all, was convinced they're absolutely a very intelligent approach to it. So they're absolutely using information, knowledge, and their own understandings to inform their investment process. So they're very, very clear about that. They're not doing this kind of because they always have or whatever. So they're very good on that. The second thing I was really clear on is they're actually incredibly expert. So I also spoke, in addition to Larry, to his investment director, who was an amazing woman, just really, really treated their asset managers as colleagues and could absolutely engage on that level. So very high level, highly skilled investment manager. And they actually understand the investment process very well and are engaging in how the investment managers, think about sustainability. So it's not just, you should get out of fossil fuels and we'll pull our money out instead if you don't. It's very much about, how can you think about the energy requirements of, they've got an endowment of, billions. The energy requirements of the US, or the world, how can they be met in a sustainable way in the future? That is the question they engage on, and they have those conversations and they work with them on those issues. So it's not a quick process, and they are still in fossil fuels, but they do absolutely come at it from a position of expertise, which I thought was impressive. I suppose I feel like, these larger foundations, we can move our money quite quickly, and to be honest, unless we tell people about it, they don't notice. But and so we can be quite noisy. These big foundations, if they don't wanted to divest, they actually couldn't reinvest the money. So if they divested from fossil fuels, they could not put that money, to be absolutely honest, into renewables, which gave them returns to allow them to still meet their grant commitments. And so they're just really aware of that, trying to balance that. I definitely feel they should anyway, but that is, I'm not their investment director, but I think they entered into what I found in that article, a really healthy and helpful exploration of how they approach things. And I think they respect, contrary to Larry's combative ways of putting things, for the ways that people do take different decisions. And I think they get it, but they're just going a different way.
Yeah, and we've linked to that article in the chat function for anyone that wants to see. I think we're going to draw it to a close, but there's been a couple of interesting comments that you may not have seen, and I think are useful to kind of think about as we finish. One was just a reflection on, in fact, from our systems change lead, so really not a surprise here of his comment, but how this is a really strong illustration really of systems behavior, and the need for this kind of systems change approach, especially for such a complex system that you're trying to tackle. And someone else commented as well in terms of the sort of collective power, what kind of change could be achieved if more of especially the larger foundations in the UK really kind of pulled their investment power together to deliver more social justice change. So it's great to see the sort of steps that you're taking to do that. So thank you very much, Danielle, for your time today, and for all participants for joining, for asking questions. Do continue the conversation on Twitter using the #NPCignites tag. And we look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow, hopefully, for our second day of the conference, which has got a really exciting lineup. Several sessions, one on using the law to fight for a fairer society, a panel discussion on the future of philanthropy, one on open source data, one on governance and decision making through the crisis, and then our closing presentation, sort of going back to impact investing. We're going to hear from Deborah Schwartz, who's the Director of Impact Investment at the US-based MacArthur Foundation, on their response to the twin crises of COVID and racial injustice through the issuance of a bond to raise more money to enable greater grant making. So quite an innovative approach. So see you hopefully all tomorrow, and thank you, Danielle, again for your time. That was great.
Pleasure.